I suppose, the nuts and bolts of the workshop, which is about actually working through the guidance for temporary waters assessment. And as Andrew mentioned earlier in the day, we're doing that, or we're structuring that according to the steps of the water quality management framework. Before I get to that, this session 4 basically consists of these 7 sub-sessions that we'll get through some point today. And again, as I've flagged, we're just going to run through those steps and talk about what sort of things one needs to consider for temporary waters. Given that we're focusing, or we're using the framework here as the vehicle for providing this information, we thought that it might be useful to give the audience a refresher, a familiarisation on the water quality management framework. So just a sort of a crash course, basically, and then that will hopefully help with the remainder of the day as we work through the steps. Okay, so just to zoom out quickly for a minute and look a bit more broadly regarding the ANZG 2018 guidelines. So the guidelines and the water quality management framework is typically used within the ANZG guidelines, and both of those are embedded within the National Water Quality Management Strategy, and that strategy was agreed and adopted by all states and territories and Commonwealth in 1992, so it's been around a long time. And has broad support. Now, with regards to the guidelines, as I think Marcus flagged this morning, it's gone through a few iterations in its time. Effectively kicked off with the ANZG 1992 guidelines and then revised in the mid-90s to form the ANZG ARMCANS 2000 guidelines, which really were a landmark resource when it came to water and sediment quality assessment in Australia. Provided a lot of detailed guidance. And as people will know, those guidelines were subsequently updated again to form the ANZG 2018 guidelines. Those guidelines effectively retain all the philosophies and guiding principles of the 2000 guidelines. They were brought across into an integrated sort of web platform, which was based on stakeholder feedback. And certain chunks of guidance and information was updated to a significant degree, but also certain bits were not updated. Just my little friendly reminder that I always put up there to remember that the guidelines are indeed just guidelines, and it's up to state, territory jurisdictions to effectively decide if or how they implement them in policy and regulation. So you'll see that they're implemented variously to certain extents and degrees. Okay, so this page is basically just providing hyperlinks. And sorry, I'll just digress quickly. Andrew, this massive slide deck we've got, will that be provided to workshop attendees in some PDF form or something like that? Okay, so where we've got hyperlinks here, if we're providing the slide deck as a resource, then people can use the hyperlinks to get to where they want to go. So this basically just lists the locations on the ANZG website where you'll find information that's relevant or has some relevance to temporary waters. I won't go through them all, but obviously there's the water quality management framework, which I'll touch on in a second. There's the temporary waters assessment guidance document, which has been mentioned already. That was published in 2020, and we'll talk about a bit today. There's also improved regionalisation of physical and chemical stresses, regional default guideline values, which will get talked about today as well. And there's guidance on monitoring, although a lot of that has still not been updated since 2000. So there's lots of guidance. However, not all of it is specifically tailored to water or sediment quality assessment for temporary waters, with the exception probably of the guidance document. And again, just reiterating, we're seeking to identify where the main gaps are to try and plug them, and that can feed into the current review or strategic planning effort. Okay, so let's move on quickly with regards to the water quality management framework. So this slide just shows, for those people who are unaware, the water quality management framework first came into existence in the 2000 guidelines, in a formal sense anyway. To be honest, I'm not sure of the extent of adoption of the framework in a formal sense. but it was effectively 5 steps depicted in a linear fashion. And then there was a lot of work done by Queensland, in fact, over the subsequent decade, a lot in relation to water quality catchment planning for the GBR reef catchments, where they subsequently worked on this and modified and improved it. And the end result ultimately was what is now the newer updated National Water Quality Management Framework. The key differences you can see there, well, now it's 10 steps instead of 5, and it's depicted sequentially, which is demonstrating that it's actually an iterative process. It's not just a linear thing and you're done when you get to the bottom. But in all aspects, it's not actually that different. It's kind of pulled some of the steps from within here out to be more explicit, and it's added a few or a couple of new steps. All right, so what is the framework? So a few details. It's basically a structured, transparent, and very logical process for assessing and managing water and sediment quality. It underpins everything in the ANZG guidelines. So basically everything in that website somehow has a place or fits in to the framework. As I mentioned, 10 steps. It's sequential and iterative, and that enables it to effectively work or operate as an adaptive management framework. It brings together assessment, monitoring and management activities under the one umbrella. So it's well integrated in that respect. It's easy to use and it's broadly applicable, which I'll get into shortly. Some steps can be undertaken in parallel, and depending on your sort of issue or your use, what it is you do with regards to assessing water quality issues, not every step always needs to be undertaken, and the guidelines work through in terms of the guidance to kind of talk through that. One of the key features is that it incorporates a weight of evidence approach. Chris, I think, will talk about that later. So effectively, that's using multiple lines of evidence to assess water sediment quality. So not just using a guideline value in almost all instances. All right, so we can sort of quickly run through and have a look at how it works. So basically, the first 2 steps are really about working out what we know about the system, what we know about the water quality problem that we're dealing with, and what's the management context around that. So what's our current understanding? And then with regards to understanding what it is we want to protect and what's the degree to which we want to protect it. Once we understand that information, we can then work to identify what the relevant indicators are to address or monitor that problem that we're looking at. Once we've got those indicators selected, in step 4, we can then actually go to determine what are the appropriate water or sediment quality guideline values for those indicators. And then in step 5, we can turn those guideline values into what are termed water quality objectives. Step 6 is sort of where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. It's where the actual assessment of your water or sediment quality against those water quality objectives is undertaken, determine whether your water or sediment quality is acceptable or whether there are impacts. And then steps 7 and 8 are new, and they're effectively asking the question, can we do better? So in terms of question 7, that's asking the question, can we do better with regards to the assessment that we've just undertaken? So have we got sufficient indicators? Are our indicators appropriate? Because we've gone through the process now, we're sort of developing a better understanding of what's going on. And similarly, are our water quality objectives appropriate? Do we need to refine them? Are they not appropriate for the nature of the system and the issue we're looking at? So it's that sort of iterative feedback loop type thing. And then question 8 is about, can we do better in a management context? So are our management strategies for maintaining or improving water quality appropriate? Do we need to test alternative management strategies? And if so, are they appropriate? We need to monitor them, etc. And then at step 9, depending on what's happened through those last couple of steps, you may need to reassess if acceptable water or sediment quality can be achieved. And then the last step, step 10, is about implementing, based on the outcomes of that whole process, implementing the appropriate management strategy, which might include action plans, monitoring plans, it's your reporting, etc. And then very importantly, everything you've learned along the way through this can then feed back in to when a next iteration of the cycle takes place. And depending on the issue, that could be of different sort of frequencies. Hugely logical and very broadly applicable and structured. Okay, quickly looking at how the framework works with monitoring. Basically, the framework doesn't work without monitoring. So you've got monitoring that is needing to be undertaken. It's highly relevant. And you've got interactions between the framework and monitoring in both directions in multiple places. So we can kind of have a look here. The first obvious one is that your monitoring data feeds in at step 6 when you're actually doing your water and sediment quality assessment. And that's probably the main one that people would tend to think of. That's when your monitoring data is being used. But in actual fact, there's a whole bunch of other interactions as well, and this probably isn't even an exhaustive list. So, for example, at steps 1 and 2, the information and understanding that you gain there actually helps you define what your monitoring objectives are. You know how your system works. You've got a handle on what the water quality problem is and what needs to be done, and that helps define the objectives. Similarly, monitoring data will feed into those steps or into step 1 to help you understand your system, etc. At step 3, you're working out what your relevant indicators are. I'll just give a few more examples. I won't go through them all. And then that informs your monitoring program. At step 4, for example, you may use monitoring data to derive site-specific guideline values based on reference sites or something like that. At step 7, you're working out whether you need additional indicators, or that then obviously feeds in and informs your monitoring program. And at step 8, if you're considering alternative management strategies, you're undertaking monitoring to assess the effectiveness of those management strategies. So you can see, hopefully this slide gives a good visual of what that interaction between the framework and the actual monitoring programs is.
You get kind of in and out.
Okay, how are we going? Not bad. Final slide, again, just want to touch on this broad applicability because it goes to the issue of temporary waters at the end of the day.
Maybe.
So the framework, again, is broadly applicable, and the guidelines provide tailored guidance on using the framework for 7 typical uses. I won't necessarily go through them, but you kind of see that they line up quite well with the regulator roles in terms of assessing development proposals, waste discharge, licensing, etc.
People just saying like, where's a good
unexpected events or assessing incidents and those sorts of
I just
things.
think it's ridiculous. If it's not bulk billed, it's just not.
This list of 7 typical uses was collated from stakeholder feedback with regards to what are the sort of the key uses of the guidelines.
Total health, and I was going to do a phone
so the upshot is basically that the framework is a tool that can be used to guide assessment of any water or sediment quality issue, and that includes those for temporary waters. And so if we're having challenges with how we assess temporary waters, at the very least, having a transparent, structured, logical process for going through and working out what needs to be done is pretty important. So I will leave it there, I think. Yeah, I will. So thank you.
Is there a time frame I can be on this or not? For the other ones there are.
Thank you, Rick. Can I just ask the people online stay on mute? Somebody's got their mic on, and apologies to all those people online that are hearing that. If you could have a look too, thanks. We've got a few minutes for questions before we break for morning tea. We've got a few minutes. So anyone in the room, general questions about the water quality management framework? Thank you, Clive.
This is more of a comment, really. Getting back to South Australia and its problems, because of, I guess, legislative and institutional issues that plague South Australia, we haven't adopted that framework. Not to say it's bad; it's an excellent framework. I think it's logically well structured, and it can really work. I just wanted to make the comment that. I hope it's not a problem for us. It doesn't seem to be a problem. No one's telling us off. But in terms of the water quality management framework circle, the number 1, the first number one on this, on the wheel, I think the first word is we, and like, we need to understand the system. I'm just making the point that in South Australia, there is no we, that there's an EPA, it's a regulator, and there's no incentives, there's a real lethargy to collectively working together with different government agencies in the community. We're the regulator, we do the monitoring, but there's no collective understanding or collective interest in improving water quality, improving ecosystem condition. So I like being here. I like listening to this stuff. It's excellent, but I really struggle with how to implement some of it.
So a couple of things. Am I correct in thinking that SA is reviewing or revising its Water Act or something in the near future, and therefore that might provide an avenue to bring it
I hope so.
up
Yeah.
into the 21st century?
I hope so. We've got a water quality policy, and there is a bit of alignment with Victoria, perhaps, but where our water quality policy, which is subordinate to our Act,
Yeah.
it points to the 2000 version of guidelines in a general environmental duty context. It means that if you're going to pollute the environment, do your best to not exceed guideline numbers. It's not a strict compliance requirement, so it's effectively a general, reasonable, practicable thing. And we're trying to figure out how do we update our policy to reflect and refer to the 2018 guidelines.
Yep.
We might have an opportunity then to go beyond the numbers, because we are stuck on numbers. In the sense of, well,
You're
the
not
new
alone, I
framework
think.
is great, but we can't use it.
Yep. Another aspect to that, and I don't know whether Ross or others want to comment. So, but for example, an industry or a proponent preparing an EIS has a responsibility to demonstrate that it'll have an acceptable level of impact, and it can use exactly this process for doing so. So it's not just a responsibility of the EPA or the public or whatever. There's the responsibility at that level, and it can feed in and be used in those senses as well. So, and I dare say that some of those other uses are, it's even if it's not legislated or your legislation makes it difficult, it's still a tool that can be used for a number of those applications.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'd add a tool that's been, gone through a very rigorous process over many years. It was interesting. I saw at the conference this week some people stepping through their own frameworks for management, and I had a chat to them quietly. It's like that there is a nationally agreed framework here that you basically, replicated, like use the weight of the process to your advantage in many ways.
Thank you. My name is Angela Arthington, and I'm here because I'm interested in water quality monitoring in the Lake Eyre Basin. And I'd like to know if any jurisdiction has used this guideline completely and fully to develop their water quality monitoring strategy, or are there any examples of documents that work through the whole guideline?
It's a great question. I don't know. I can't speak for states and territories. I don't know the extent to which they use this framework. Yeah. So that's heading. Certainly in working with industry, they are usually very amenable to taking this sort of thing on board. So for example, working with Sydney Water, they see the value in basically working through the process exactly as this. Another benefit to that is they can then communicate to the regulator that they're using the nationally endorsed framework for monitoring, assessing water quality, which is obviously a useful thing to be able to promote. So I think there are numerous examples of industry using this approach, and there are probably examples of some of the states and territories using it as well for specific issues, but not sure. But Ross or Chris may have some additional comments. Or Andrew, anyone?
I mean, a lot of those things are sort of tied up in processes that you don't actually get vision on as well. I guess that's part of the issue.
Hi, Rick. So my question is, who are the stakeholders that you had in mind when you developed the water quality management framework? So it was the focus group.
Everybody. Sorry, who was a focus group who?
Yes, so whom you had in mind when you developed the guideline, the framework?
It's effectively anybody involved in any sort of assessment of water or sediment quality issues. But in terms of the stakeholder consultation that was done, that targeted a whole range from industry, government, academics, students, and then industry was approached through peak bodies, etc. Quite an extensive consultation done right across sort of broad stakeholder group, obviously states and territories.
I just want to follow up on the responses to the question I asked before. What I've learned is that there are examples, but they're scattered across industry and maybe the jurisdictions. But what I want to know now, is there any intention to pull together a document where any one of us could go and look at these examples, or has anybody reviewed them, or is there any intention to review them?
Okay, so thanks. You've jogged my memory. So there are examples, and there are 2 case studies on the website. One is for the use of the framework with regards to Ranger uranium mine. The other one stems back to what I was saying earlier about where the revised framework came from, and it was from the work done in Queensland around catchment management planning, etc. For the reef, and there's a case study on the website of Queensland's use of the approach with regards to reef water quality protection. One thing we found in sort of communicating the revised guidelines was that one thing that users really find helpful, which is I think the reason for your question, is that case studies are very useful for people to understand how something works and to get a feel for it. And so one thing that was always intended but hasn't actually eventuated yet was to add more case studies. But when the framework was only published in 2018, obviously it'll take some years for the uptake for then those case studies to become evident to be able to publish. So it's something that could feed into the current strategic planning exercise for the guidelines, is the development of more case studies to assist users. Yeah, thanks.
Look, we're going to have to call it there. We're actually cutting into morning tea time, I've just realised. So, and that's terrible. So we've got we'll come back in 10 minutes if we could. And if you have questions and you have swapped into other sessions, that would be okay. So short break for those online. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Hello. Just apologies to those online. We're trying to herd the cats into the room, but we're missing a bell. And there's a number of other workshops that are distracting. I did whistle. We're starting again. Anyway, we might just get going because we do have a lot of content to get through, and I'm sure people will start filtering in. I can see them starting to move. So next up, we have Chris Humphrey. He's going to be talking about steps 1 and 2, which is about your conceptual modelling of the ecosystems and getting an understanding of your community values and management goals. So if you could, Chris.
So I'll do step 1, then Ross is going to do step 2, okay? Right, so step 1 is current understanding. This step is addressing what we know about the system, understanding the water body and the water quality issue. And from all of that information, we can start to define both the monitoring objectives and to populate the a few of the ensuing framework steps that come out of the conceptual model. So the main guidelines and the guidance document that came from the workshop on temporary waters recognise two components to the conceptual model. So firstly, we've got the control or the process model, and that just looks at the system drivers and their interactions basically outside of human disturbance. So this is basically how the system behaves in naturally. So the stressor model we depict over the top of that, and it looks at the effects of pressures and stresses on the receptors and the indicators of those interactions. So now you can see where the pressure stressor ecosystem receptor sort of framework comes in, which is carried right through to all of the other steps. So from all of that understanding, we've got a basis for identifying the key community values, setting the management goals, which Ross will talk about, selecting the indicators for the various lines of evidence at step 3, and then determining the appropriate water or sediment guidelines at step 4 and the subsequent step for the water quality objectives. So next bit. So I guess the direct water quality impacts to temporary waters are pretty clear cut. They'll arise from agricultural activities, urban land use, in temporary waters in particular. Mining is a major contributor to potential changes in water quality. But I guess, and this comes out in the guidance document, and it's pretty, I think it's really well articulated that possibly even the greater threats in these dry environments, given waters is so scarce, is the alterations to the water regime. So how and when water is distributed in the system. These alterations can arise from dewatering activities, for example, habitat alterations from changes to hydrology, which I'll get to in a minute, or impacts from, domestic stock or feral animals. So at the end of the day, and ultimately all of these pressure types will affect water quality. So we need to be considering the relationships and interactions amongst all of the pressures. Right, this is the rather complex but elegant generic conceptual model that came out of the workshop. It derived this generic control model with drivers and processes divided between the landscape scale, which are the yellow boxes, or the local and catchment scale, which are the green boxes. And all of those ultimately affect water quality at the bottom of the thread, as it were. It's not the intent to dive into each of those, threads one by one, but just to suffice that there's sort of several key processes, high-level processes that we've extracted from this generic model, and that's climate, landscape setting and geology, the land use, vegetation cover and sediment processes, hydrology, and the biophysical components that affect water quality. I guess central to this whole conceptual model is that wetting and drying cycle. And you see it's in bold, it's a higher font size. It controls all of those other processes. And the biota specifically are adapted to that wet and drying cycling. So it's those, I guess, those interdependencies between the surface water and the rest of the system that are so important. And that's conferring ecological values to the whole ecosystem. But this was something in the sort of the Queensland list of questions, you know, what values are these systems that are, you know, maybe only wetted for a small amount of the time, and maybe Alicia and can follow up on that as well in some of her presentation. But basically, if we look at those 4 attributes there, the climate, land use, etc., we can start to formulate questions against each of them. And I've just thrown in a few examples here, but there'll be many depending on the system. You know, is the catchment naturally mineralized? Do the organisms, for example, have some sort of pre-adaptation to, you know, slightly higher metals than other systems, or is the other waters soft versus hard, etc.? Will natural groundwater inputs alter the surface water quality in particular phases of the hydrograph? So later in the hydrograph, you might have your groundwater table relatively high, but the water level, surface water level is dropping proportionally faster, and therefore the inputs of groundwater are proportionally greater. What's the fate of the contaminants? Where's it going? Is the bed permeable or impermeable? So is it ending up in sediments or depositional zones downstream into the underlying groundwater? And as I was saying earlier about that groundwater input to the surface waters at recession is a critical time. And, you know, is the dilution of the surface water, wastewater runoff, or that contaminated groundwater going to be reduced? The hydrology and water budget and so forth. What are the biogeochemical processes that are occurring between the surface water and the stream bed? For example, is the underlying groundwater will invariably be anaerobic, and that confers particular chemistry to the system. Has the hydrological regime of the system been altered? And I'll get to that in the example conceptual model that I've got. The biophysical components, how well do we understand natural water quality changes across the hydrograph? More often there are successional changes in organisms. In salt lakes, for example, there are species that are only tolerant of the fresher water, but there are other species and they drop away, but there's other species that are far more tolerant to the higher salinity through the evaporation and concentration processes. How well do we understand the ecology of the system, including the refugia and, you know, the seasonal succession of organisms? Often you might need to go to the literature on this because there's some good understanding of some of the basic types of temporary waters that Ross put up earlier, and understanding of those systems and what you might expect. When a sensitive life stage is likely to appear, is their appearance likely to coincide with remobilization of sediment contaminants, for example? And it's early inundation, of course, we can get some hatching of early sensitive life stages. That could be a critical stage, for example, or later in the hydrograph when the pH drops off, that's going to exacerbate metal interaction, for example. Okay, now this is one of the conceptual models that was presented in the guidance document, and I've just embellished that a little bit. This is the process model, firstly, that captures the episodic wetting and drying of salt lakes. It dilutes the surface salts at inundation, then concentrates through the evaporation phase as the lake dries out. So as I mentioned earlier, the resident organisms are less tolerant of higher salt concentrations. And so you can see the species richness aspect of this particular process model dropping off. Then if we add the process model, so in this case, it's mine dewatering activities. They deposit hypersaline saline waters into the systems, which pushes the system into that lower diversity state. Okay. Now I'm going to take this a step further and consider another model for this particular system. So we've got our original one over there to the right. So we can add other stressor models to the original one. And that contextualizes the salinity model a little bit better. So this model just focuses on the altered water regime that's caused by the groundwater discharge. So we've got a disruption to the wetting and drying cycles. That means that any obligate estivators in that system now probably can become eliminated because you've made the system permanent. You've also got waterlogging of the margins, and it's well documented that those littoral marginal plant communities are going to similarly become impacted and fall away as well. The other aspect of that is the actual discharge, the groundwater discharge can erode the substrate, and it leaves the bottom of the lake pan unsuitable for attached diatoms. This means, so I've summarised some really good work that's been done in some of these systems, and there's now a good wealth of information that's coming out of it. I guess it's useful. So I guess this points out that it's useful to compile all of your stressor models. So the water quality and the other models, because in these systems in particular, mining does cease, and there's some reasonable examples that some of these systems can recover. But what's also present in the hypersaline salts is metals and nutrients. So if you only had these two particular models and your trajectory was not going back to one of recovery, then you would need to invoke some of the other stresses just to see, what's going wrong. Is the metals are not going to go away, for example. So, is it the cause of non-recovery, for example, arising from metals? I think that's all I had for this one. And Alicia is going to come up and present on this one here.
Oh, g'day. So I'm Alicia Stewart from Queensland, the Department of Environment and Science. Andrew Moss introduced me earlier. I see myself kind of sitting on the periphery of water quality guidelines. So Andrew's group works on guidelines. I'm in a group called Water Planning Ecology, and we tend to do some of the work to assess how the water plans are going. And historically, for the last 20 odd years, we've been assessing the health of rivers and streams throughout Queensland. So I've just got a few slides here, lots of pictures, and a bit later on in the session today, I'll contribute to the indicator side of things, because my interest is particularly dry riverbeds, so not even water. So it's but I'm interested in how the quality of the water affects dry river bed ecosystems. In the Lake Eyre Basin and Murray-Darling, one of our main pressures is feral animals. So we've got oodles of pigs, feral pigs, feral cattle and just domestic cattle as well. And as you can see, they do some pretty nasty things to riverbeds when it's dry, and perhaps this can affect what's going on when those systems are re-wetted. So you can see that the pigs rooting around, they're searching for mussels and things like that, really churning up the riverbed, and also contributing nutrients during that process. What am I doing? There we go. So as part of our aquatic ecosystem health monitoring that we do all over Queensland, we develop some generic conceptual models based on a pressure stressor response framework that was shown earlier. So we have a generalized understanding of the ecosystem, and we develop our indicators from there. So in the past, we'd used aquatic macroinvertebrates as indicators of ecosystem health, and now we're more focused on the pressures, the stresses, and then how that can affect the ecosystem through ecosystem responses. So if I can point here. So just in this conceptual model, you can see we've got cows pooing, contributing nutrients that way. And as I mentioned, also that pugging and trampling of the sediments, some pigs in the background there, but also this is my area of interest. So the ecosystem that's there during the dry phase. And I'm particularly interested how the water quality proceeding affects these communities. So if there are suspended sediments, nutrients, toxicants in that release water, if that is dropping out, entering those interstitial spaces, those cracks in the clay or those spaces between the substrate, cobbles or whatever, how is that affecting the terrestrial system? So terrestrial invertebrates particularly. And also during the dry phase, it's also it harbours the desiccation resistant stages of aquatic things. So some of your crustaceans, your fairy shrimp, your clam shrimp. So how are they getting impacted during that dry phase by cattle or by that water that's come through and dropped out, whatever? How is that affecting those aquatic things when they're hatching or whatever, like we were just mentioning before? I think that was all from me, but I will talk a bit more about dry riverbeds and terrestrial invertebrates during the indicator session that we'll have later. But I'm definitely open to questions, so hit me. Any online?
Online? Oh, sorry. Just a delay before it kicks in. No questions online. Any in the room? Nadika, right? Thank you, Nadika.
It's not a question, it's mostly a comment. Actually, it is very nice to see that the addressing the biogeochemical processes in sediment and sediment water interface, because we are mostly talking about water quality guidelines, and it is very, very important to see in the sediment and what is going on the sediment. It is always, yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Live.
Alicia, is it? Yeah, hi. In South Australia, we've got a conceptual framework for assessing a dry riverbed, creek bed, without there being any water there. I mean, as I said before, with South Australia, we're dominated by dry systems. So we've come up with a framework that evaluates riparian zone density, extent, riverbed sediment characteristics, whether or not it's dominated by organic matter or fine sediments, and potential for sulfidic conditions, dry algal coverage, extent and type of dead algae, and a broad description of adjacent land or upstream catchment land use characteristics to come up with a weight of evidence approach for that creek condition. So it's probably a different line of thinking to what you're doing, but we needed an approach that describes the condition of a waterway without there being any water there.
Oh my God, that's so, that's very, very exciting. I really like that idea of looking at the dried algae, for example, and also the riparian conditions. So in addition to terrestrial invertebrates, we look at, so we can assess the riparian zone, whether there's water there or not. And that's something that can be affected by, pigs and cattle. So in addition to the terrestrial invertebrates, we do some riparian surveys as well, and also look at the like percent weeds in the riparian zone. But what you're talking about is really cool. And I mean, this is really early days, so I'm pretty familiar with what's going on around in the whole world, and I haven't heard of people doing what you've just talked about. In Southwest California, they're interested in assessing the dry phase, like what you're talking about, and they looked at things like bryophytes and terrestrial arthropods. But I'd love to talk to you later about like dried algal mats and that organic matter, and yeah, that's totally up my alley. So that's really, really cool to hear. Thanks.
Anyone else with questions in the room? Sorry, I'm bouncing between things or online. Anyway, let's move on with Ross. Apologies if I've missed someone online. I've lost my iPad. But we'll pick it up after Ross's session. If there are questions, you won't miss out. So thanks, Ross.
Okay, thanks. Yes, and apologies again for the voice. So community values and management goals is step 2. And this is really where we start to collate what that knowledge we've built up in step 1, what does that mean? Where do we want to take this? What are going to be the primary goals? And when I say we, I mean, this really does need to be a collective decision. And usually the biggest stakeholder in the room is going to be the regulator, honestly, in all practical purposes. But there are other stakeholders that need to be engaged and included in it. And for a large proportion of the temporary waters, when we haven't had the map up here yet today, but the 75% of the Australian landmass that is semi-arid and arid and dominated by temporary water systems, most of that and large proportions of that is going to have native title over it. The biggest, most extensive and longest term knowledge base is going to be from the traditional owners. Indigenous knowledge is going to be critical to understanding these systems, and never underestimate and never exclude culture and spiritual values for consideration in these systems. There's going to be often these systems, the temporary waters in these semi-arid and arid landscapes almost inevitably will have a role to play in storylines. They will almost inevitably provide critical resources to traditional lifestyles, not just traditional lifestyles, but they will. So they'll provide bush tucker, they'll provide drinking water, they'll provide fishing. All of those sorts of things will be focused on water in the landscape. In the dry landscape, water is always a focus of human attention. Often that means that there'll be long-term historic usage of that, particularly perennial refugia, perennial water bodies, which will often be also associated with middens, collections of grinding stones, other sorts of archaeological connection and evidence of long-term occupation of the landscape. Many of the places that I've worked in where we've also had some interest in some other type of resource, such as mineralogy, also in story and in culture will have some other connection, often connected to that very characteristic that makes that water body of use for modern consideration for mineralogy. They're often sickness places, birthing places, ceremony places, because they're geologically distinct within that landscape. But I think not just for traditional purposes, but for modern purposes, a scarce resource in a dry landscape, water, will be of typically very high value. It's where we take our camper vans and we go and pitch our camp when we're going recreational usage in the semi-dry and areas of Australia. Typically, we're going to be doing that somewhere around water. So what we need to do is align the management goals with the temporary nature of those systems and discuss that around all of those uses of that landscape, consideration of the recreational and aesthetic values, the culture and spiritual values, and hopefully as a default, the aquatic ecosystem values. I think I skipped over that slide. And also consider here management goals for legacy sites. A lot of our legacy sites in Australia, we've got, I think the value is around 50,000 legacy mines scattered across Australia. A lot of those are in these temporary water systems, and they have values as well from the modern cultural values of those areas, but also the legacies that they've left behind. And we'll give a case study a bit later today of a legacy mining operation in a temporary water system, which has got a legacy of impact, detrimental impact on that system. How do we set management goals to bring that system back, given that it's only got water in it for part of each year? And that obviously delays the implementation, the responsiveness of the system to any improvements that we make as well. So a very brief overview on community values and management goals for temporary waters. It isn't fundamentally different than it is for setting community values for any other type of water system, for perennial water systems, except that typically the value of the water will be heightened by the fact that there's not much water around and it's there for a shorter period of time. They're more valuable rather than less in temporary systems. Anyway, are there any questions online or in the room?
In the room, there is nothing online. Rick?
On here, Rick's going to correct me when I said wrong.
No, I'm not, Ross. And I don't know that you mentioned it, but just to, I suppose, to clarify for people here and online who may not be so familiar with the terminology, but
Sure.
community values effectively is the term adopted at the national level, but analogous to terms used in states and territories that might be environmental value or beneficial use or designated use. We're effectively talking about the same thing here.
That's right. So yeah, we've now got the terminology where an aquatic ecosystem is a community value, but it's a terminology. It's not saying that an aquatic ecosystem is only important if it's a community that likes it.
Clive has a question or comment.
Thank you. You
Yeah.
alluded early on to the cultural and spiritual values of waters as a community value. Just wanted to mention that South Australia is exploring the declaration of cultural and spiritual values, or adding that to our existing set of declared environmental values or community values.
Yeah.
And I'm keen to know if other jurisdictions are doing that, and how you go about it in terms of engagement processes and so on. So we're very early days of trying to figure out how to implement cultural and spiritual values of waters.
And that's a really good point, Clive. There is specific documentation developed for that within the guidelines. It's very well done. I highly recommend that you have a look at that. And when we've rolled the workshops on introducing the guidelines around the country and in New Zealand, we've typically had a special section just on that, done in Australia by Brad Mogridge when we've been able to get him. he's too busy, unfortunately, these days because he's too valuable and we can't get him often enough of these workshops. And sorry, I'm losing the memory of who was the leader of writing that document from the New Zealand perspective. Does anybody remember in the room? Roken. So that's good. Certainly, Clive, I've had personal experience of incorporating cultural and spiritual values into site-specific guideline development in Northern Territory, and to a lesser extent in some projects, really not necessarily getting all the way through to environmental permitting and regulation in Queensland, but at least in terms of conceptual design of approaches in Queensland. Were you raising your hand, Susie and
Andrew.
Yeah, as I pointed out in my talk, I'm sort of interested in this, what value you put on like dry gullies and things like that, because often mine sites will be located towards the top of the catchment. But then if you say, well, there's cultural values to that gully, I mean, where does it leave us? Does it mean we don't do mining anymore, or is it, have you had any sort of thoughts about that?
I don't think it does, but obviously, the mining industry is always dealing with the fact that engaging with your traditional owner stakeholders, in some areas, they really would rather that you weren't doing any mining in, and it may well be a mineralogical resource. I said I worked in projects where there's been very strong storyline connection to the mineral deposits, and that's a conversation that has to be had before a decision can be made.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to what extent does the economic question come into it? If the mine's going to make millions of dollars and create lots of jobs, and there's a storyline, who wins?
Yeah, well, and that can be a difficult conversation, but not that it can't be done. And I've been involved in those sorts of conversations with some very high profile Indigenous activists within Queensland. But obviously there are competing value systems there, and I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong, Andrew, but it is a conversation that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I was just interested in exploring it because it's a very difficult issue.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not unique to this context of this workshop either. It's increasingly an issue that needs to be considered for lots of other uses. So, we're doing offshore wind projects in Western Australia where there's 40,000 years worth of archaeology under the ocean where the people are connected to that and still have story connection to that. So yeah, it's a ubiquitous issue across the country.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment about environmental values. So the last year I did a stint in water planning water policy. And we were working on environmental values. We've assigned them for surface waters, but I was working on a project where we were assigning them to groundwater. And there's something like 10 different environmental values, of which cultural and spiritual is one. And there's other things like irrigation and stock and domestic use, recreation, goes on, and aquatic ecosystems. But for every groundwater and also every surface water that we've looked at environmental values, cultural and spiritual is standard for everywhere. We don't say, yes or no, it just is. So out of all the 10 potential ones, it's always aquatic ecosystems and always cultural and spiritual values that are default. Because we don't know otherwise, but for those reasons that the water's there, so they must have a value if they're, the last water in the landscape, that sort of thing.
I totally agree.
But just another comment after what Andrew was talking about, values of dry riverbeds, and I could prattle on and on because that was what my PhD was about, values of dry riverbeds. But if anyone wants to chat later, I'm happy to go into it. But there are lots of values, including cultural values. I mean, even just using them as walkways when there's no water, driving down them. There's all sorts of human and ecological values of dry riverbeds. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, often ceremony sites. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I don't think, Alicia, that I've worked anywhere where we've done other than what you just said, the default inclusion for every reach of every waterway that we think about. Aquatic ecosystem and cultural spiritual values always apply. Other things might come and go, but you're actually preempting one of my slides a bit later in the deck, but totally agree with you.
Thanks. Yeah, just to follow up on that again. So are there any additional values that are specific for temporary waters that we tend to not assign for permanent waters that need consideration? Or are we finding that effectively, like Ross suggested, it's kind of ubiquitous? It's the issue of community values is the same across permanent and temporary waters. Is there anything we need to consider more here for temporary waters, is what I'm asking Ross and Alicia and others?
I think a lot of the values are heightened. So even in dryland rivers where we do flood harvesting in order to get irrigation water for later in the year, the importance of that flood harvesting is often very much heightened in that landscape, and the effect of that then on the environmental flow availability later in the flow cycle. So I don't know that it's any different from perennial systems, but the scarcity of water in the landscape heightens the importance of water in the landscape. As a general rule, I think you can apply that.
And would you say that creates more tension between those values?
Yes, it can. And Andrew was alluding to that, you know, the economic value of that versus the other values of that and how you play that tension across. I mean, that's why in the guidelines, we put such an emphasis on stakeholder engagement at step 2 and bringing those viewpoints into the room. Shelley. Yeah.
I think this one's actually crossing the boundary between what Alicia was saying before and what you're saying, is that with temporary waters and particularly the upper edges of those frameworks, whilst there's not necessarily water present, there is a fairly dominant ecosystem that's pretty much ubiquitous right throughout, and that's the riparian community. Yeah. It may not be large, but yeah, pretty much every satellite imagery you'll see, you can trace those water courses by the riparian community. Yeah. And so a lot of the stuff that we do, your comment around riparian surveys, they're embedded in what we're doing because that's probably the most persistent part of the ecosystem in those, even in the really ephemeral systems.
Yeah. And where do you set your campsite up? It's in the shade of a red gum or a coolabah or something on the bank of a river. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, Shelley, that's a good segue. That's where I was going, that Andrew raised a dot point there about broader environmental values, but with temporary waters in particular, it's, I think we've got to marry the water quality and the habitat protection together and somehow draw those together, because all of what Alicia's saying and so forth is that interdependency and so forth is so critical.
And so this is just great discussion. I think I had the shortest slide deck of anything for the whole day, and we're getting the greatest discussion about it. It's fantastic.
Oh, look, and we're looking for that. I mean, you know, we're actually running fairly well on time, so there's plenty of room. So if you have your questions, please, and if you think of a question that's related to a previous session, that's okay too. Like just raise it. Don't be shy. We're all okay.
Apart from cultural and spiritual values, I mean, we have Indigenous cultural values, but also societal ones. An example, in case anyone's interested, of what a value of a dry riverbed would be in a human sense. Does anyone know what the Henley on Todd Regatta is? Yeah. Okay, so that's a boat race down the Todd River when it's dry. Lots of fun. I imagine it's brings in a lot of money to the community, and it's been cancelled, I think, a couple of times due to water. So water was bad in that situation. And that's just an interesting cultural value of a dry riverbed. If it was wet, it wouldn't exist. Thanks.
Okay, if there's no other questions, there's nothing coming. Oh, sorry, I should probably check. We may move on to oh, hang on, we do have some. Just give me a second. Let me. So we've got one from Greg Clayton. Policymakers and water planners are giving more attention to first flush events, resetting the system. Any comments?
I welcome it. I think it's a good idea. I think it's also a little complex to deal with that. And I think, Chris, you're going to be talking through some of those concepts we had around timing of first flush events and relative sensitivity. So I won't preempt that. But it is an important phase. Obviously, when the water first gets there, a whole round of things are triggered. And so it is important to think about that. And it's also when you tend to have the worst water quality, and that really first inflow can be pretty terrible. So it's an important phase to consider, but I don't want to preempt a more deeper consideration of that. Chris is going to give a little bit later today. Next session.
Yeah, and I think we might have covered it a little bit. So any specific guidance on obtaining cultural and spiritual values?
There is guidance in the document. Certainly encourage everybody to have a look at that. The one theme, when Brad and I've shared that presentation at the various workshops, the one theme I would encourage to everybody to consider, and we normally in Western society get it wrong, is the time factor of that. Take time. Allow time and allow time to build rapport and respect and ability to have that conversation. You just can't fit that into a 6-month consultancy contract, believe me. But it's so important.
We have another interesting one from Melissa, and it's about modified systems having actual values. So give me a moment, I'll read it all out. If the modified environment provides more opportunities which are considered significant to the natural landscape, at what point does the modified system need to be maintained compared to returning the environment to natural conditions? For example, a mine creates a local ecosystem which is considered significant by the local TOs based on new opportunities and habitat that is created. Are there any risks that a modified system may need to be maintained if the value it has created is greater than the natural environment? Any guidance on how cultural aspects might be approached for this type of scenario?
I think we said get the stakeholders in the room and have the conversation. And again, that's not a trivial thing. So we spent a lot of time working for a power plant south of Hampton that discharged cooling water into a temporary water and made it perennial. Made it perennial for over a decade, actually 30 years, and then was looking at shutting down that power station, shutting off that supply. That conversation with the stakeholders, with the community, was really quite difficult and prolonged because everybody had seen the value of the perenniality that was artificial in that system, and returning it back to the natural intermittency was not necessarily as valued. But you couldn't just keep the power station in place either. So not an easy conversation, but one that you need to have. You need to get stakeholders in the room and have the conversation, preferably before you're about to turn the tap off.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, let's move on. To step 3, defining relevant indicators. There's a bit of content in here, so take it away, Chris.
Yeah, big focus on this.